And I came out of this class pretty much convinced that homeopathy was ridiculous. I didn't understand how people could believe in something that sounded so outrageous. And I was devoutly skeptical until I was traveling through India with a friend. And her mom was a homeopath, so she was traveling with her homeopathic kit. And we were in the place called Pune. No, I wasn't in Pune, I was in Hampi. And I woke up seriously sick, like throwing up. I won't go into all the details. And she comes in with her little kit, offers me some pills, and I'm just like, they're not going to hurt me. I'll take your silly sugar pills to appease you.
Welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We're your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm Hilda Labrada Gore and this is episode 184. Our guest today is Ananda More, homeopath and the filmmaker behind the movie Magic Pills, Promise or Placebo. In both the movie and in our conversation, Ananda has us consider whether homeopathy is science-based or some kind of sugar pill placebo that affects millions and endangers lives. If you consider yourself a skeptic or simply want to dig deeper into homeopathy, listen up. Ananda tells us the rich history of homeopathy, and she explains its founding principle of like cures like. She talks about the latest scientific developments around its efficacy and why there is a bias against homeopathic medicine, and how she first came across it when she fell ill during a trip to India. It's a riveting conversation about an ancient healing protocol. Before we dive into it, just a word that the Weston A. Price Foundation has something free for you. We have an info pack that includes the amazing principles of traditional healthy diets. And it's free, that's right. In it, you'll read about Dr. Price. You'll see pictures that he took and learn about how our modern diet stacks up against those of people groups around the world. You'll also get a better handle on what a Wise Traditions diet looks like today. Just go to the homepage of our website and click on the green button that says Request Free Info Pack. It's that easy. And a big thank you to our sponsor, Ancestral Supplements, the makers of Gallbladder with Ox Bile. Based on the ancient wisdom of like supports like, they put New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Ananda.
Thanks so much for having me, Hilda.
I'm eager for the listeners to hear your story about your first encounter with homeopathy. You told me that you thought it was hogwash before you were ever associated with it. Please tell us more.
Well, in university, I did a fun course called Witchcraft and the Occult. And in this class, we got to study about homeopathy. So you already see what subject matter they're placing homeopathy under. And I came out of this class pretty much convinced that homeopathy was ridiculous. I didn't understand how people could believe in something that sounded so outrageous. And I was devoutly skeptical until I was traveling through India with a friend. And her mom was a homeopath, so she was traveling with her homeopathic kit. And we were in the place called Pune. No, I wasn't in Pune, I was in Hampi. And I woke up seriously sick, like throwing up. I won't go into all the details. And she comes in with her little kit, offers me some pills, and I'm just like, they're not going to hurt me. I'll take your silly sugar pills to appease you. And I was blown away when 15 minutes later, it was like I wasn't sick. I hadn't been sick at all, and I felt fine. And I was in this kind of encampment with little huts, and it turned out that tons of people had gotten sick. And people were sick for days, where within 15 minutes, I felt completely fine.
Well, that blows me away. Can you help us all understand what is actually the premise behind homeopathy?
So the first tenet of homeopathy is that like cures like. So it's similar to the idea of vaccination in that you're giving someone a little bit of what makes them sick and stimulating the immune system to protect them. So, for example, we might use coffee as a substance that we know that will keep you awake for someone who's having trouble sleeping. So that's that first notion, like cures like. Hahnemann, who was the founder of homeopathy 200 years ago, back then they had a really profound understanding of poisons, but they didn't understand too many other things in terms of how they worked in the body and their symptom picture they produced. So in that time, he started using poisons to try to help people with this like cures like notion. And he had to dilute those poisons so that they wouldn't be toxic in and of themselves. So over time, he started discovering that if he diluted and went through a process of what we call succussion, or shaking that bottle really hard, that for some reason the medicinal properties of those substances became stronger. And so that's become one of the more controversial aspects of homeopathy, this idea of dilution.
Yeah, because I've heard people say, oh, it's sugar water or predominantly water, so it can't possibly have any medicinal properties or effects.
Right. Well, there's a few ideas within the scientific community. Like one is called hormesis, which is a well-proven effect that the more you reduce a substance and provide it as medicine, that the effects of it change and almost become the opposite of what they do in larger, more toxic doses.
Hormesis?
Hormesis, yes. So we take this idea and maybe take it a little bit further. So we do have homeopathic remedies that are in material form, like when we call dilutions at 6C, which is diluted by a factor of 106 times, you'll still have material doses in there. So there you could really be looking at a level of hormesis happening. But as we get beyond 12C, we're going beyond Avogadro's number, which is a point where, according to chemistry, there should be nothing left of the original material in that remedy. And yet we start to see the effects growing and hitting different layers and deeper ways of working.
That is so fascinating, because I guess so science is saying, well, this is as far as it can go, but homeopathy pushed that boundary and found something new.
Well, homeopathy pushed the boundary before Avogadro discovered his theorem. And what science is finding now, there's a lot of work that can actually back up what homeopathy has been saying. We have chemical engineers who've discovered nanoparticles of source material at very high potencies. How they're getting in there and where they're coming from, we don't fully understand. There's also a notion of electromagnetic fields being created within the water, and water molecules themselves being informed by the nanoparticles taking on specific shapes. Water is such a new field, and we know so little about it. You know, there's water conferences, there's water scientists, and our understanding is tiny. And so many aspects of water break the laws of physics as we understand them. So
can you give us an example of one?
When something gets colder, we tend to think that it compresses, but water expands as it freezes. So that's an interesting example of it not working according to the laws of physics. There's a lot of questions that even I don't understand at that level because I'm not a physicist, but around the rotation of the nucleus of water and how it changes of the hydrogen atoms. There's all kinds of different types of water. So and we're just scratching the surface on understanding how water works. So can it carry information? Can that notion of a memory of water really stand up to scientific scrutiny? And I would say it can. And when we're talking about nanoparticles, we're getting into the quantum field, because nanoparticles, or quanta, act in a very, very different manner. And so we don't fully have that understanding, and we could be looking at nanomedicine, quantum medicine, or an actual information being carried by the water molecules themselves.
This is all clicking for me because I've spoken with Dr. Jack Kruse and others in this quantum health field, and they say water, for example, carries light. And so it's a conduit for giving light and energy to our bodies in ways beyond my own understanding. So this makes sense to me that water could carry and bring important information to our bodies to bring healing.
Mm-hmm. And there's people out there doing research on how is that water communicating with our bodies. And there's really interesting work coming out about mitochondria, which may actually be the nucleus, the real information that's held within the cells and the real part of the cell that controls the cell functions. And there's really interesting views of how mitochondria will communicate with each other around the entire body using electromagnetic fields, and how those remedies could be communicating directly with the mitochondria using that as a signature. Again, it's still not developed. Nothing's been published. These are the beginnings of speculations. But again, homeopathy is not unscientific. I think science is just starting to catch up, and we're just developing the tools to understand homeopathy.
Well, as a member of the foundation and as a chapter leader, we understand that our ancestors didn't know all the scientific reasoning behind why, for example, a woman who is expecting should have fish eggs regularly, what that would do for her body or the baby's growth, but they did it, right? So I can understand why maybe homeopathy was effective before they even had a handle on how it all works scientifically.
Sure, and in some ways, Hahnemann was very scientific in how he went about trying to understand homeopathy. So he developed the notion of provings, which is very different from how allopathic or conventional medicine at the time was developing. So he would take a substance to try to understand how it affected the body and observe, which is one of the key aspects of science. Let's do something and observe what happens. And that's how Hahnemann started. But that notion of like cures like is ancient. Hippocrates talked about that. And you can see that playing out in different types of tribal medicine and indigenous medicine. So that in itself has been around for a long time. It was 200 years ago that Hahnemann, reading all that work and doing his own experimentation, was able to incorporate that into medicinal practice.
Coming up, Ananda tells us about her daughter's life-threatening asthma scare and how she used homeopathy to heal her. And she also explains why she believes that the pharmaceutical industry is threatened by homeopathy.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions Podcast, sponsored by the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Mike, the Heal Your Gut guy. Are you dealing with digestive issues? Do you react to delicious sourdough bread and other starches? Do you pay dearly when you eat cheap foods? Mike, the Heal Your Gut guy, also suffered from these issues even when following Weston A. Price dietary principles. Mike will show you the extra steps he took to heal himself and how he helps many others take care of gut issues like Crohn's, colitis, IBS, SIBO, and Candida. Mike will show you how to heal your gut 100% naturally without drugs. And the Heal Your Gut Guy YouTube channel has the videos you need to heal your gut. You don't have to walk a dietary tightrope. Just search for the Heal Your Gut Guy on YouTube. You'll find tons of free information rooted in the laws of Mother Nature and ancestral wisdom. And Gallbladder with Ox Bile by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements offer New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and gallbladder with ox bile in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. Our early Native American ancestors would commonly take a buffalo, cut it open on the spot, and eat the warm liver seasoned with gallbladder and bile. The bile was sprinkled on various organs and glands as a condiment, the way we might use mustard today. Word has it that gallbladder and bile did a whole lot more than just improve the taste. Gallbladder, ox bile, and liver provided concentrated amounts of gallbladder-specific building blocks, bile and liver that support our biliary tract, gallbladder, liver, bile ducts, and such. And they are now absent from the modern diet. So visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Well, you are just glowing with health as you're talking to me. I'm like, Hilda, pay attention to what she's saying. Because Ananda, you look beautiful. So has homeopathy continued to play an important role in your life?
Well, I did become a homeopath, so I would say yes. But it's been huge in my life in terms of my own healing process. I dealt with chronic pain for over 10 years, which I tried many modalities to help, and it was only homeopathy that really resolved that pain for me. In terms of using it within our family, it's our key form of medicine. We've never, since my daughter was born, we have been prescribed antibiotics, but have never had to use them because the homeopathy always resolved the issues fairly quickly. And I mean, it's also lifestyle. It's consciousness of how you eat, how you exercise, and all of that. But homeopathy has been definitely our go-to in our lives.
Tell us a story about your daughter and her struggle with asthma.
Sure. So it wasn't too long ago that I brought her with me to a conference in Brussels. and she was just recovering from a pulmonary infection. And suddenly she started to have asthma symptoms out of nowhere. She's perfectly healthy. We've had no problems with her. And suddenly she'd have these attacks where she couldn't breathe very well. The first time it happened, we just arrived in Brussels. It was 2 a.m. and suddenly she woke up unable to breathe. We rushed. I gave her a homeopathic remedy. We rushed to the hospital. And by the time we got there, she was fine and had no symptoms. And they did not believe me. They basically told me I was a hysterical mother and that maybe she'd been hyperventilating. But the symptoms started to get worse. It got to the point where she was having an attack every hour, and the conference was finishing, and we were heading to Israel, actually, and I had to get on a flight with my daughter. I was terrified of what could happen. So and none of the homeopathic remedies I was trying were doing anything. So we went back to the hospital, we got a puffer, and that got us through the flight. But right after we got that puffer, it was the middle of the night. We were heading back to our hotel, which was in a pedestrian area, so you couldn't even get an ambulance close by or a cab. And suddenly, out of nowhere, she had the worst attack we had ever seen. She couldn't get any air in and out of her body, and so we used the puffer, and I was so grateful that that was in my hands right at that point. It saved her life, no question. And then it took us a few months to really figure out the right homeopathic remedy for her. Most of the keynote acute remedies weren't really working, and I finally took her to my homeopath, who came up with a very unproven, unknown remedy based on what we call remedy sensations. And after a single dose of this, we were able to completely remove the steroidal puffer, and she went from having to use the puffer 4 or 5 times a day to once every couple of weeks, and within a couple of months she wasn't using the puffer at all. And it's been over a year now that she's been free of it and she's an athlete, she's a competitive dancer, she used to do competitive acrobatics, so all those things would irritate and bring on these attacks, and we haven't seen one in a long time. So I'm very grateful that we could go to that depth, which steroids and salbutamol could never do.
So you yourself have seen personally its efficaciousness in your life and in your daughter's life. Tell us more about what you said earlier, something about new scientific developments that are pointing to the fact that this is something that can be proven to be effective.
Well, we have tons of clinical research. We have over 1,000 clinical trials, and only 5% of them are negative for homeopathy. So it doesn't mean that 95% are positive. It actually means, I think, 40% are like that they didn't come to any conclusion. They're inconclusive, and 55% are positive. So when we actually look at the medical literature, it more strongly supports homeopathy than not. We also have a lot of basic science that's slowly growing. So we can look at in vitro and in how remedies are affecting cells. So we have studies looking at cancer cells and how they react to different remedies. We have studies that look at mast cells, which are immune cells that are related to allergies and inflammation, and how they respond to homeopathy. And some of these studies have been replicated many times. Now they're doing studies having to do with polar dyes and different ways of actually seeing that a homeopathic remedy or homeopathically prepared water responds very differently from ordinary water when it's put to these different tests. So there is a lot out there, but there's also a couple of studies that are very negative towards homeopathy, and they're being used to prove that homeopathy doesn't work. One of them came out of Australia and is incredibly biased. The person who headed that study was a member of a skeptic organization. When looked at the methodology of the study, it was incredibly corrupt, and it was rejected for peer review. Yet based on this study, we're shutting down access to homeopathy all over the world. The other thing that happened after the study came out was that the Australian Homeopathic Association did a freedom of request on that study and learnt that an initial study had been done that was not negative towards homeopathy, and that they buried it. So now there's this huge campaign happening in Australia and really globally to have that first report released, because that first report was said to be of very high quality, and yet they dumped it, buried it, and redid the study, hiring someone who is a skeptic.
Why am I not surprised that a natural remedy would get pushback? It's because, does conventional medicine, are they threatened by this kind of approach to wellness?
They shouldn't be, but what I think, it's not conventional medicine. I feel it's the pharmaceutical industry that has a lot to lose if homeopathy is effective. There's studies showing reduced use of antibiotics. I know I'm not allowed to speak about vaccines as a registered homeopath in Ontario. We've been silenced on many levels, but there is something called homeoprophylaxis, and we talk about it in my documentary Magic Pills, where we show how the Cuban government stopped an epidemic in 2 weeks using homeopathy when they didn't have enough vaccine available. And this work was done by a pharmaceutical company that makes vaccines. And they replicated it with many different diseases. So the threat to the pharmaceutical industry, should this work and provide a safe way to prevent disease, especially when vaccines aren't available for certain diseases, I think that's really threatening. Really threatening.
You mentioned your movie. Talk to us a little bit about what got you started on that project and what it covers.
So it's a documentary on homeopathic medicine, and it really looks at how the media and the skeptic community have portrayed homeopathy. And then it challenges that narrative by looking at how homeopathy has been really used on a large scale in the world successfully, and what the actual evidence base really says. So it all started when I was at a conference, and Dr. Gustavo Bracho from the Finley Institute in Cuba, who's an immunologist who dedicated his life to making vaccines, led this intervention in Cuba with a homeoprophylaxis against a disease called leptospirosis. They gave remedies to 2.3 million people and stopped the epidemic in 2 weeks. And moving further into the future, the rates were below historical levels in that part of the country, whereas the rest of the country, the rates of the disease continued to increase with the arrival of more hurricanes. And so leptospirosis is a disease that's spread when there's flooding, and hurricanes cause that. So it was very hard for people to avoid getting sick.
So why haven't we heard about this incident in Cuba? What's up with that? Like that sounds amazing and very promising for the future of wellness when diseases are getting out of hand.
Well, when the Finley Institute tried to have their research published, they got rejections from every major medical journal. And they were shocked because these are medical professionals, but being in Cuba, they're not under the same threat of the pharmaceutical for-profit industry and that lobby force. So they weren't exposed to the anti-natural medicine kind of lobby and world. And when they tried to have their research published, they got all these excuses that just didn't make sense and weren't scientific as to why their research couldn't be published. It did eventually get published in the journal Homeopathy, which is a peer-reviewed journal, and it is indexed by PubMed, but because the subject matter is homeopathy of the journal, it's not well respected in medical circles. So it's problematic. There's a huge publishing bias because the journals make money off of pharmaceutical advertising in their journals. There's also this, I think, issue of a paradigm shift. And a lot of the skeptic community and some of the scientific community are really materialist. They can't see beyond the idea of there being a chemical reaction in the body. Can we heal outside of just a chemical reaction? And their answer is no. So it kind of is a huge paradigm shift for them, and they're having trouble with that as well, I think.
Well, as we're talking about how promising this is, your own experience, the science backing homeopathy, my question is, why is it still so fringe? How can we get it more into the mainstream?
It didn't used to be so fringe. The oldest medical association in the U.S. is the American Homeopathic Institute of Homeopathy. They were around since before the AMA. We have a memorial to Hahnemann here in the middle of Washington, D.C., and President McKinley, who was pro-homeopathy at the time, was there for its inauguration. We used to have huge hospitals in the U.S., or you did, I'm not American, but like in Philadelphia, the Hahnemann Hospital, which is still there, and it's a massive hospital, but it doesn't use homeopathy anymore. So it was very systematically shut down as part of the mandate of the AMA. and they did a very good job because the homeopaths were not well organized at the time. And now it's really a battle of being a consumer, a challenge for consumers and parents and people who want to maintain access to homeopathy around the world. You need to be heard. I would encourage people to sign on to our mailing list at magicpillsmovie.com, because we send out information when there's letter writing campaigns, when there's petitions to be signed. And right now I'm here in Washington, D.C. as part of an action and an event called Homeopathy on the Hill, which is being hosted by Americans for Homeopathy Choice. So I encourage you to visit their website and sign on and become members of their organization. And they've brought mothers from across the country. There's at least 150 people coming to meet with their congressional representatives and to talk about why homeopathy is so important to them. So it's an glorious, I think, historic action here for homeopathy. And the more grassroots movement we have to grow it, the more we can educate others on what homeopathy is. We can bring it out of the fringes. But it isn't that fringe. It's a multi-billion-dollar industry in the U.S.
Well, we will make sure to put a link in the show notes to your mailing list and to the Americans for Homeopathy Choice group and to your movie, because we want to encourage people to have private screenings, community screenings, to kind of bring this out into the open so more people can learn about it. I want to ask you now, Ananda, as we come to a close, if the listener could do one thing to improve their health, what would you recommend that they do?
Well, if you've tried everything out there and you're eating well, you're keeping your body active, I would really consider learning about homeopathy, seeing a homeopath, and maybe incorporating that into your life. It can help you avoid all kinds of medications and optimize your health.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thanks so much, Hilda. It's a pleasure to meet you and be here.
Our guest today was Ananda More. Check out the website for her film, magicpillsmovie.com. And I'm Holistic Hilda. Follow me on my own adventures on Instagram at Holistic Hilda. For the complete show notes for this and all podcast episodes, just go to our website, westinaprice.org. And that's it. Let's keep in touch, everybody, and I'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening today. We have all kinds of resources to support you on your health journey. On the Weston A. Price Foundation website, you'll find podcasts, blogs, articles, and brochures related to just about any health topic you can imagine. You can also find a local chapter to help you discover sources of real, organic food in your area. And you can become a member to support the Foundation's mission of education, research, and activism. Visit westonaprice.org for all this and more. And remember that the Wise Traditions podcast is available on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.